what's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and today I want to talk to you all about Affliction Warlock heading into patch 9.15 PTR. Now, it is, I guess, it's Sunday night, essentially Monday morning. It's 4:15 in the morning, and I wanted to record a series based on each spec for Warlock, looking at the changes I'd like to see for that spec heading into PTR. Now, I was debating making a video just covering all three specs, but I feel like it would be a long one, and one that I feel like there'd be some things we're actually just missed in it due to the actual length of it. So I'm going to try and do one AF Destro demo, releasing one day after another. Depending on when PTR releases, there might be a bit of a overlap with PTR releasing and changes being desired versus actually being pushed, but we'll see. Now, I would assume this being a 0.5 patch, PTR probably is going to last about a month, give or take a little bit more, a little less. I'm roughly guessing that the PTR will be like on retail servers probably somewhere around the end of September, give or take a little bit. But regardless, Blizzard has mentioned that they are looking at pushing, or I guess making some tuning passes, some changes to talents and class abilities. Now, when it comes to 0.5 PTRs, typically they make changes for tuning, they buff talents, nerf talents. Sometimes they change toolkits. Very rarely do they end up adding in actual talents or removing talents. However, we have seen it before with, example, Death's Embrace towards the end of Legion. I believe it was 7 point, like 6 point, whatever, 3 or 2.5. We saw Death's Embrace given to Warlocks as a talent. So it's not outside their own possibility. I wanted to start off with Affliction because I feel Affliction is the spec that needs the most attention. Technically, you can make a case for demo too, but it probably needs the most attention heading into 9.1.5 PTR. Now, the best way to start off with that, I felt, would be doing a brief, I guess, review of how AF has performed this tier. So, Affliction Warlock in Sanctum, for the most part, the difference between 9.0 and 9.1 is that they nerfed Affliction's single target a substantial amount. We no longer have the huge Focus Malignancy Conduit, Rapture was nerfed, and our single target is very lacking. We probably want one of, if not the worst, single target class in the actual game. Interestingly enough, if you scroll through Warcraft logs looking at top 10 parses for Sanctum of Domination, there are a couple AF parses sprinkled in, but there is a common denominator here. Note that, okay, there's PI, sure, but note Legendary, Decaying Soul Satchel. Decaying Soul Satchel. Moving on, I assume we might see some here at some point, but Remnant, Soul Satchel, Satchel. A lot of PIs here, but you know, that's just one of the nature of the game. All satchels. Now, Soul Render is a little different because it's Sow the Seed spam, which if you've been playing Afflock, you know that Sow the Seeds is very, very strong right now in Mythic Plus and in heavy AoE scenarios, and it's further empowered by DSS and just the strong AoE profile that it brings every single minute. Painsmith even. Now, we don't see any here in the top 10, but even recently there's been some Afflocks popping up on Painsmith playing, lo and behold, DSS. Now, there's been some Wrath of Consumption parses along the way. I think there might be one a little bit lower here, but DSS, which is Decaying Soul Satchel for those who aren't familiar with it, has really propelled Afflock into a spot of an interesting spot. It's not on its own on single target fights, or I guess two target fights, exceptionally powerful. But similar to how Mythic Plus is, if you can pull a trash pack onto a single target boss, if you can have ads spawn or ads are spawning on that boss, like Soul Render, like Remnant Orbs, like certain points of Eye of the Jailer, moving even further down, like Fate Scribe ads, and you can get Decaying Soul Satchel Cleave out of a Soul Rot, AF will put out very strong single target because the haste stacking is multiplicative, and you get a 20% crit bonus too every single minute. That being empowered with Korain or other effects, Field of Blossoms, can make AF very, very, very strong in certain settings. We even see it popping up a bit on KT here playing DSS. A higher parse playing Wrath of Consumption, but this is an interesting push time playing ID and things like that. So we expected this to be a big demo Destro tier, which for the most part it was. But with DSS popping up now, albeit the strats are a little more gimmicky in a sense, but they're not all pad strats. They do relevant boss damage if you can get Power Infusion, or whether you have it or not, get the actual haste amps in the windows where you have your 4 target DSS cleave. Now, once again, in the raid, probably the worst spec at all. I guess worst is not a great word to use for it, but the least powerful spec in normal scenarios for Warlocks as a whole right now. But when it comes to Mythic Plus, AF is doing very, very well, and that is mainly due to, well, Sow the Seeds and Decaying Soul Satchel once again. However, AF single target damage is very lacking. Even playing a build that's a bit more skewed towards it, for example, playing Focus Malignancy over Rolling Agony on Tyrannical Weeks, even playing Siphon Life, which we thought might be a play on Tyrannical Weeks, really isn't worth, you know, the extra value we thought it would be. Right, that Agony is still good on trash. STS still good in AoE, and even on Tyrannical, that damage is still relevant. You know, it's like entering a Toyota Corolla in the 500. Like, you can paint it and put new tires on it, with the engine don't work, it's sort of just not worth it, and you play whatever is, you know, I guess good in a different sense. So today I want to review talents, conduits, and a few things along the way that I hope to see for Affliction Warlock heading in the 9.15 PTR. Let's get into it. Okay, so I want to start off addressing the actual baseline toolkit of Affliction, because like Blizzard mentioned, they're looking at potentially making changes to actual baseline toolkits, which the way I interpret it as looking at buffing certain abilities. And the number one ability I think they should buff is actually Summon Dark Glare. Now, whether they actually buff the eye beam damage or just change the way that it actually works, I think Dark Glare needs a reevaluation, because it's essentially the same, it's in the same form that it was in BFA, but we lost unstable affliction stacking, and our dots are dealing probably about the same, maybe a little less, a little more, give or take, due to from BFA. But we also have Malefic Rapture being a thing now, which does feed off dot extensions. You can get more dot extension value with Soul Rot, with PS, whatever, what have you, which leads to more Rapture value. But Dark Glare as a whole is a very, very low portion of our damage. If I just open up here doing a half decent rotation, I don't know if I'm playing the right Soul Line, give or take, didn't even orb here, but like doing just like a half broken opener, just going into this here, hitting our Soul Rot, we'll hit our Dark Glare, and we'll do a full cycle. Let's spam some seeds, why not? We'll do a full cycle here. You'll see Dark Glare damage in 3 target is exceptionally low when we get through this, but even when it comes to single target, Dark Glare ends up being like 4.5 to 5% of our damage, which, depending on fight time and duration, it's actually a bit less, a bit more, depending on the actual like duration of the fight, but it's still not much at all. Now, compared to Destruction with Infernal and Immolation Aura scaling in 2 targets and 3 targets, or looking at Demonology with Decon, Dark Glare is easily the weakest cooldown of all 3 specs, even looking at the dot extension and things like that. Once again, I think that's just due to mainly it being in the same form that it was in BFA. Here's the actual breakdown. I-Beam is 5% of our damage, and the thing just expired. It is abysmally bad. And this is in 3 target. Even if it went to single target, it would be pretty low, especially we have a minute and a half of the coming off CD. So the first thing I hope for is they address Dark Glare in some way. Now, I think there's different ways to do that. I spoke to TSG about this a little bit. We'll get to it more in the conduit section, but the number one thing, I mentioned a few different things they can do. One is to actually increase the tick rate of our dots when Dark Glare is active, meaning the duration stays the same. You can keep the extension, but they tick 33% more often or faster, however you want to word it, which number one would mean more shard gen during Dark Glare, some more raptures, more seeds, whatever, but just more actual dot damage. Now, I think Blizzard's a bit afraid to buff dot damage even more, because of how Antorus and things went, just stacking Shadow Priest and Warlocks, because if dot damage is your entire profile, why would you not bring anything but dot classes on 2 target fights? You're just twice as good as warriors or DKs or whatever can't do 2 target cleave, right? But I think that would be more than fine. That would be acceptable, because we don't have UA stacking anymore, and our dots hit for much less than they did in Legion. I believe a bit less than they did in BFA too, partially because of UA being gone, but partially just because, well, they've been nerfed again over and over. Another way to look at it would just be to straight up buff I-Beam damage, even though it's a single target effect. It would be a bit of a single target increase, which is what AF is looking for. Now, I think there's ways you can also like empower your Dark Glare, which would be sort of cool getting in the conduit section in a bit here. We'll talk about it. But the first thing that needs to be addressed, I feel, is Dark Glare. It gives them an avenue to buff AF single target damage and also buff it on like a 2-minute cooldown, so it's not exceptional. It's not just like that insane single target profile 24/7. You have a strong profile every 2 minutes, sort of how Demo is every minute with Tyrant, but it's more consistent regardless. So I hope Dark Glare is one of the things that they actually end up evaluating, because it's just felt so lackluster for the longest time. At this point, I mean, you hit it obviously, and the change to Dark Caller going baseline in 9.1 is nice, but we lost Shadow's Embrace, which is like not an equal trade-off, because we had Cold Embrace. So we essentially lost like what, a 13% damage amp with Cold Embrace and Shadow's Embrace being active, and traded it for a 2-minute Dark Glare. But Dark Glare doesn't do anything really. We have a 2-minute dot extension instead of 3, and it lines up with Dark Soul. The baseline toolkit is better for Affliction, but the damage trade-off was not there at all. The Rapture nerfs with Dark Glare, like just swapping things, didn't feel like it was totally finished in 9.1. Maybe a bit rushed, so I'm hoping they end up looking at that in 9.15 PTR. Now, the only other real thing I think needs to be addressed for AF's, I guess, baseline toolkit, it sort of relates to Sow the Seeds, but I mean, it's a part of the baseline toolkit if you're playing Sow, and that's what we're playing Mythic Plus. I think this was changed either going into BFA or Shadowlands, but I talked about it on stream today, and I'm pretty sure, and chat agreed, that it was a thing in Legion, and that's casting Seed of Corruption with Sow the Seeds. I have 4 targets here. Sow the Seeds hits 3 total. Let's cast it. There's your seed, 3. Cast it again on a target that has seed on it. It flies onto the 4th target that's unseeded. But if I cast seed again here, it doesn't pop the seed. Those seeds pop because they expired. So previously, I'm 99% sure in Legion, Seed of Corruption hitting a target that has seed on it used to pop seed. And what we've been encountering in Mythic Plus a bit lately, I've talked about it a lot on stream, I've seen it a lot on stream, a lot of questions asked about it, is when I'm spamming Sow the Seeds in Mythic Plus with DSS active and a lot of haste and things, my seed is not always casting 3 times on 4 or 5 target pulls, because it's casting 1 seed or 2, and that's because your previous 3 targets have not popped their seed yet. Now, if you're way back here at max range casting seed with an insane haste amp like this, I mean, yeah, okay, I wouldn't have dots rolling here, but you can sort of see the seed hits and you're casting another seed. There's 3, there's 2, right? So it'll happen. Now, if you're in melee or closer to melee, it's not that big of an issue, but it's still an issue in itself. I'm pretty sure this was a thing in Legion, seed would pop seed. Now, pretty much like I said, you can play around this by being closer to actual melee, just hey, because your seed has less travel time and you're still spamming, like, you know, seed with haste effects, but it's easier and faster to pop, so it can be avoided in the first place. It's not like we're asking for some insane buff that's going to make seed even better. You can basically avoid the issue, but there are times where you can't be that close to melee, or there are times you get stuck out and you have to put your field down in the back, and that would help this issue a lot. It's more or less just a quality of life QOL kind of change, but I think it's actually a pretty big one, and one that's sort of overlooked when Sow the Seeds was buffed. It's been a thing for a little while, I believe, but the Sow the Seeds buff actually made it a lot more relevant and frustrating. So that is the second thing I'd like to see addressed for the baseline toolkit of Affliction. So getting into the conduit section of the video, AF conduits are sort of in an odd spot. None of them are really amazing, and we sort of even have a dead one in Corrupting Leer. AF is one of the 2 specs you end up playing Soul Eater with, mainly due to the conduits being pretty poor, unlike Demonology, which has 4 insane conduits. So starting at the bottom here, Rolling Agony, for the most part, I think it's fine. It's very relevant on 4 to 5 weeks in plus, or times where you have 3-4 targets and you need that extra agony extension, the extra duration. It does indeed Pandemic as well, so your agony lasts an eternity. I have a 226 one. Rolling Agony is fine. It's not really a DPS increase if you sim it in, but at the same time, if you're able to spam more seeds, the more packs you have, the more targets, the higher the key goes in Mythic Plus. It essentially is. Rolling Agony is fine for what it actually does. Now, moving on to Focus Malignancy here. This is one of the conduits that was nerfed substantially, in addition to Rapture and Shadow's Embrace becoming a talent in 9.1. I believe Rapture Malignancy buffed Rapture by 23% or something, I think roughly, in 9.0, and they nerfed it. This is essentially a Mythic 1 from Denathrius. Like, it's 226. They cut it in more than half. And that, in conjunction with the Rapture nerfs and SE changes and all of that, really hurt AF single target. I'm going to have a section of the video briefly at the end here talking about what is the best change I feel for AF single target damage increase, what can be done, but a buff to Malignancy is one of them. You could revert it to the way that it was previously, and I don't even know if that would be enough. It probably wouldn't be, but it would be a step in the right direction. AF does not need to be the best single target spec in the game. It doesn't need to be better than Demo, or even Destro necessarily, but there's a pretty substantial margin between Demonology and between Affliction. I pulled up a Guardian of the First One's log a minute ago here. I had to scroll about 3,000 DPS down to find the highest AF parse compared to the highest Demo parse. I would not be surprised if Malignancy got buffed to some extent in an attempt to address AF's lack of single target. And it's also relevant in Mythic Plus on trash packs, just like priority mobs, your haunt target, your FM target. It gives you a bit of that extra priority damage, which, you know, has sort of been like AF's token thing with Haunt or Shadow's Embrace and UA not stacking to 5 anymore. Now, this could potentially be an issue in Mythic or in PvP with the Endless Affliction talent, but there could be like a modifier put in there or a DR on that. That's important to keep in mind. Withering Bolt replace Cold Embrace in 9.1 because Shadow's Embrace is now baseline next to Haunt. So I just don't, this is sort of in the same boat as Malignancy. It was an insane conduit when it first came out. We were having 100k plus Shadow Bolt crits, which we knew would never happen when it went live, right? We were playing Nightfall, insane Necrolord stuff, and Withering Bolt. But similar to Focus Malignancy, I could see a buff to Withering Bolt because Withering Bolt functions in a way, it says damage per time over effects you have active on the target, which means if you're in a 25 target scenario, you have 10 dots rolling on each mob, but the one mob you're hitting is going to only get the damage amp from the dots that are on itself. It's not going to get the amp from every other dot on other targets here, for example. It's only the amp on the dots on that one target. So you're not gaining some insane amount of value having 5-6 targets. It's literally a single target conduit only. Now, it's a bit dangerous empowering Drain Soul and Shadow Bolt to an extreme amount with Necrolord stuff and things. But let's be honest, Necrolord AF is terrible. It's not good. And this is so far gone as far as nerfs are concerned that you can probably bump this up by 100% and it wouldn't even be that bad. So Withering Bolt, Malignancy, I think could just honestly both use some substantial buffs. With the Rapture nerf staying, I wouldn't be disappointed. I wouldn't be surprised if they return Malignancy to where it used to be, like percentage wise, scaling wise in 9.0 comparatively to 9.1, and also just maybe buffing Withering Bolt by a little bit here. Now I'll get Corrupting Leer. I was gonna save this one for last, but Corrupting Leer is one of those conduits. It's one of those things that just feels like a patch was rushed, and this is one of the unfortunate casualties. It doesn't do anything anymore. Agony and UA have a 5% chance to reduce the cooldown of Summon Dark Lair by 5 seconds. Now, we played the 1 minute meme build in 9.0 with Wilfrid's and this thing and what's it called? Dark Caller, which was the 2 minute Dark Lair reduction cooldown, right? Or talent. But Dark Caller is baseline now. We have a 2 minute Dark Lair baseline. You're not getting your Dark Lair to 1 minute in single target. Probably even playing Wilfrid's with this ability. And Wilfrid's is not good for AF. It is terrible. It's not good at all. Even if you could get a 1 minute Dark Lair, I don't think the extension of every single Soul Rot window would be worth it over something like Malefic Wrath or Synergy or even DSS, depending on what fight you're in. So that's not a very realistic thing. Now, they could change the way Leer works. But honestly, I think the best thing to do, I was speaking to THE about this tonight as well, is probably just to overhaul Corrupting Leer and make it into something different. Now, THC's idea is to make it buff your Dark Lair to a certain extent. He cited one of the Shadow Priest conduits. It does like 10 things at once. I've seen it before. I forgot what it was. But he cited it as like, make it increase eye beam damage by a certain percent. And also have it apply, I guess, or attack every mob that has agony applied to it, which is very similar to what we suggested in the 9.1 PTR feedback spreadsheet and document, but I wholeheartedly agree. It would sort of address AF single target issues, and you probably have to like devalue the amount of damage it gave I-Beam in 4 or 5 plus target settings, but at the same time, it puts you in a spot where you have to decide, okay, what do I want to do? How many agonies do I want to apply in this 8 mob, 9 mob pull before I start spamming Seed of Corruption and cast my Dark Lair and things, right? So it puts you in that spot where you have to make a bit of a decision, but it also empowers your Dark Lair, helps solve that issue, gives you more single target damage, and probably has a bit of a DR on it in 2, 3, 4 target settings. But I think it's a pretty good way to take Corrupting Lair. At this point, I don't think it's really going to see much play anywhere. It's just a very mediocre choice. Now, Soul Eater is universal. This thing's just good. Soul Rot does a good bit of damage. This thing is a 50% damage increase. It's just good. So for the most part, Agony, I think, is fine. These two just need to be buffed damage-wise across the board. I think this is one of the better ways to address AF's lack of single targets, and Leer probably needs an overhaul. There are a handful of ways you can take it, but just I don't want to see Leer in his current form in 9.1 or 0.15, whatever, because it's essentially like AF only has 3 conduits. This thing is just a blank slate. So as far as talents are concerned, there are some that definitely need attention, and some that are probably just okay the way that they are. 15 row, Nightfall, ID, Drain Soul. Personally, I'm happy that Drain Soul is the choice here. Drain Soul feels like the filler AF should have baseline. Now, it's a talent. It's the best one we have. That's fine. I'll take it. It works. But ID and Nightfall aren't, I guess ID. Nightfall is okay-ish. Nightfall was changed in Shadowlands to have an actual increased chance of proccing based on the number of corruptions you have active, which is nice. And ID is just ID, which is affected by Wrath of Consumption and is good in 2+ target settings. The thing is, so is Nightfall. It's good in 2+ target settings. And you also want to play Drain Soul in those settings because you want to snipe shards. There's a lot of redundancy in this row. I wouldn't hate seeing ID maybe moved to like the 45 row, for example, in place of Shadow's Embrace, or maybe I don't really want to see a talent that I want on the same row as Drain Soul, I'll be honest, but I would not mind seeing ID move to a different row. Now, I probably wouldn't end up taking ID over Haunt, but at the same time, that does put you in a spot where Haunt is more or less your single target, like priority option, and ID is your 2+ target option. And then you have this, which is an abomination, which we'll get to in a minute. But that puts you in an interesting spot because, you know, if you had Shadow's Embrace in this slot, for example, you probably would play it. And hey, technically you maybe make Corrupting Layer work around it, right? But you probably would play it in single target, because that's still a 9% damage amp. You probably play it with Haunt, and it, you know, I don't want to get into the Shadow's Embrace memes, which is an example more or less where to move it. But what I'm getting at is there's a lot of redundancy in this row. I think Drain Soul is the best choice. It is. I love playing with it, but I would like to be able to play ID. Nightfall wouldn't be bad, albeit, you know, you can't play both Nightfall and Drain Soul together, which is why I wouldn't be surprised to see Nightfall, or sorry, ID move to some other row in the actual AF tree. Now, 25 row here, Writhe, AC, Siphon Life, they all have their own place. It's typically Writhe and plus with STS, Siphon Life and single target. Absolute Corruption sort of falling by the wayside a little bit this patch, I feel like, but still fine. Still good in plenty of settings. 35 row, so the Seeds, PS, and Vile Taint, your single target option, your heavy AoE option, and Vile Taint is more like your fast nuke AoE kind of option, but I think STS has really taken its place. I don't really know how they would address this without just like replacing the talent, because STS is just so strong at this point. But I don't think this row's horrendous. Vile Taint saw some play on Stone Legion Generals, and I feel like this tier, looking at a few fights, I mean, maybe like, depending on how stacked things were on like maybe Remnant, if you need to burn a bunch of orbs down, it might have seen certain play at certain points for the extra rapture damage you get every 20 seconds versus, you know, a 45 with PS. But regardless, and let's be honest, Remnant's probably not the best example of that, but it stacked AoE kind of fights, you know, maybe Fate Scribe, for example, or Kel'Thuzad, for example, with stacked adds, skeleton spawning, or with fragment spawning. That's a better example, but in the end, STS is probably just better at doing that in the first place. So that's just the 35 row. It's fine where it's at, but I wouldn't mind seeing something change with Vile Taint. 45 row, Shadow's Embrace, Haunt, and Grimoire. This has always been a weird thing, having these two on the same row. They're very similar, but Shadow's Embrace can be stacked in 2+ target settings. And keep in mind, the duration was increased to 16 seconds in 9.1. It's not as miserable as it was before. Number one, due to that. Number two, due to more haste and things. So now it's 9% damage to amp versus 10% on Haunt, and the minor the minor damage application you get whenever you cast it. And you have the clauses: if it dies, Haunt's cooldown is reset. So these two have shared a row for a long time. Shadow's Embrace's baseline, previously in 9.0, which I thought was fine, but a bit tedious at times. Now, I didn't hate it as much as everybody else. I would have liked to have seen it just stay around with a 16-second duration instead of 12. But regardless, I don't really expect many changes in this row here. These two are probably fine where they're at. That's just sort of how it is. This has been AF for ages. The big thing in this row is Grimoire of Sacrifice. Now, I've talked about this so many times previously, but Grimoire of Sacrifice used to actually be, you know, one of our better options because it was a flat damage increase. It was like a 10% damage increase or an intellect increase. But Grimoire is in such a bad spot for Destro and AF. It's been this way for a long time. Hunters have Lone Wolf, which is, I think, a 10% damage increase. Mages have Lonely Throne, or Frozen, what is it called? Frozen Throne? Lonely Winter, if you don't have a pet out, which is just a flat damage increase. But locks were given Sacrifice, and then it was changed to some weird proc that doesn't scale in 2+ target settings and just deals damage, has RNG factored into it. I would love to see Sacrifice just go back to a flat X damage increase or an intellect increase, because at the same time, you've got Haunt and single target or priority settings, right? You've got Shadow's Embrace in 2 target settings, and they're both fine in plus, but what would be really awesome is to have a flat damage increase that would scale in 3+ target settings, whether it's a flat damage increase like 10% or an intellect increase. That is a spot that Sacrifice could fill. This row is more than fine, and plus you've got Haunt for your priority damage and SC if you want it, but Sacrifice could be so much better, and depending on the tuning, it might even beat out Haunt or SC in this row. But unfortunately, it's been this abomination of a state for a long time. So if any talent change comes in, I would love to see Grimoire of Sacrifice overhauled. That's my number one choice of any AF talent, is to have Sacrifice overhauled and be in a spot where it's at least playable again. I'm not asking for it to be better, but it doesn't scale in 2+ target settings. It's RNG. It's just a bad damage proc as a whole. 50 row. Soul Conduit is Soul Conduit. It just depends on procs and how relevant raptures are and what the actual % chance to refund is. The big thing here is Creeping Death. So the play for a while, forever, has basically been Dark Soul Misery in this row. But Creeping Death's been one of those abilities that's like really cool, to me at least, but not really played because it's just not very good. Your Agony, Corruption, Siphon Life, and UA deal their damage 15% faster. This reduces the duration of those side effects, and it does not increase Agony shard generation or anything along those lines. It's sort of misleading. It's a reduced duration on the effect, but you get the... What I would like to see for Creeping Death is to keep the same duration, but have the actual tick rate increased, and probably have it increased past 15%. I feel like it's just not strong enough in the first place, especially when you're comparing something like Dark Soul Misery, which is very strong with haste effects, dot effects, rapture windows, decaying, soul satchel, multiplicative haste stacking, and Dark Lair, which syncs perfectly with Dark Soul now. I would like a world where you play Creeping Death in certain settings. I think it'd be really cool, but it's also counterintuitive with rapture windows because the dot duration is reduced. It's just awkward. It once again feels like it was one of those things that was like left behind from BFA, similar to Dark Glare, but we have rapture now, which wants dots to be active longer. And it's not the end of the world, but it's sort of counterintuitive. We lost UA stacking, which makes Dark Glare not as good as it was before with dot extensions, and we don't have Death Bolt anymore. It feels like Creeping Death alongside baseline summon Dark Lair are just sort of relics of the past that weren't really addressed when it came to Shadowlands, but saying it since literal alpha. So I wouldn't mind seeing a buffed Creeping Death, maybe an actual amp to the damage effect they deal here, just an amp somewhere. Because Creeping Death's a cool ability. I would love to play it in certain settings, like 2+ target settings. I think it'd be really cool, and it makes micromanagement of AF pretty awesome. But in its current state, it's just not really going to see play anywhere until they address the actual issues. Out of all those things being said, though, the biggest thing for Affliction, which we touched on a little bit in every section, I feel is addressing the lack of single target. Now, we know Affliction is very, very good when it comes to AoE with DSS, with Sow the Seeds. I'm not asking for AF to be the best spec in the game in single target. All I would like to see is it be just not the worst spec when it comes to single target. Because like I said, you know, you can put new tires on a car, and you can paint it and sponsor it in the 500, but if you got no engine, it ain't gonna go anywhere. Now, that's a bit excessive because AF is still very good in Mythic Plus, and we probably will see some Warlocks in the MDI this time around, but the lack of single target is an issue. I think more so in raiding than it is in Mythic Plus. Number one, due to Dagger of Necrotic Wounds being an option you can take, and number two, being able to build your comp around things and sort of pull trash on the bosses. But when it comes to raiding, you can't always do that because some bosses are limited to patchwork or just, you know, under constraints that don't allow that to actually happen. So there are a few ways to address this. Now, I've spoken to THD about it a bit in DMs. We talked about conduits, right? Withering Bolt can be buffed, Malignancy can be buffed. Either of these are fine options. Now, I think a buff to Bolt is actually probably a fine spot to be in because depending on plus, you might even be playing Bolt. You might not be. But a buff to either Malignancy or Withering Bolt, my personal preference being Malignancy, would be substantial. Now, I don't know the actual modifier for it. It had to be probably a decent amount because we're probably looking at a few hundred DPS margin we'd like to see bumped up at least for Affliction. Number two is Dark Lair. You could buff Dark Lair's I-beam damage. You can go the Corrupting Leer route. You can go one of many ways because like we said before, we don't have UA stacking to 5 anymore. We have Rapture to spend shards. We don't have Death Bolt anymore either. So in BFA, you cast 5 UAs. You put up your Dark Lair. You launch your Death Bolt. You do an insane amount of damage, and your Dark Lair was a part of that because your Dark Lair extended UAs, and Death Bolt dealt damage based off the remaining time of your dots left in the target. Now, that interaction had to be nerfed 3 to 4 times because it was OP, but still, Dark Lair sort of feels like a relic of the past, and one that hasn't been addressed as nearly as much. It hasn't been addressed, and it needs to be looked at. Whether it's I-beam damage or somehow it makes your dots tick faster when it's out, that would be a fine thing too, I feel. And it wouldn't actually be too OP in Mythic Plus for the most part, I don't feel. It might actually push you more towards playing Siphon Life or Wraith on Tyrannical weeks. The thing that THD mentioned, which is also pretty interesting, we talked about it for a while going into 9.1 when these issues happened, or when the nerfs happened, these issues arose. You also have the option, oh, you can buff Rapture. There's that too, we know that. But THG's thoughts, you can buff Unstable Affliction. Now, because you're limited to one target with UA, this might cause some issues in PvP because of Endless Affliction or whatever it's called. But let's be honest here, like, you know, you can just put a DR on it or something like that, right? You can buff Unstable Affliction. The thing is, I'm pulling up a log here from a Guardian of the First One skill from the #1 Afflock in the world currently on it. His damage breakdown is 27% Drain Soul, 14.3 Rapture, 11.5 Unstable Affliction with a permanent uptime of 99.47 essentially. So the thing is, you can buff UA, but I just feel that with how much help AF probably needs in single target, excluding like decaying soul satchel, you know, rapture windows of PIs and lust and stacking effects. It's probably going to have to be a pretty substantial buff to unstable affliction, probably somewhere around doubling the damage that it deals. Now that might not be a bad thing because UA is limited to one target, and you can't, it's sort of like your priority target extra burn dot, right? It empowers your raptures more if you're playing malignancy. You wouldn't have to go the route of buffing conduits because you already nerfed them. So it's definitely a thing that could potentially happen, and honestly probably the easiest fix that they have. Now I think dark layer changes are more relevant and probably should be addressed too, but it probably is the easiest fix that they have. It's just straight up buffing unstable affliction and probably nerfing it or DRing it a bit in arenas and PvP and things like that. Either way, however they want to approach it, you've got conduits, you've got talents, you've got dark layer buffs on its own, you've got corrupting layer you can overhaul, or just UA buffs. Either way, there's plenty of options, some being a little better than others, I feel, but there's plenty of options. And in the end, I just want to see one of them, because AF's AoE is great. I'm not looking to be a jack of all trades, best in the game, but I think people can agree, even like if you've seen Afflocks in Mythic Plus, even if you've been beaten by them in Plus, that the single target is a bit of an issue and probably needs to be addressed heading into 0.5. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this video, I guess, gave y'all a better understanding of what Afflock looks like, or has looked like in 9.1, and probably some of the bigger issues that hopefully are going to be addressed in 9.15 PTR. Now, once again, Blizzard has said PTR will be hitting sometime this week. Technically, it's Monday morning, so it could even be hitting in a couple hours. Well, a few hours from now. I hope I haven't gone to bed yet, but we will see. Now, let me know what you guys think of these suggestions and things in the comment section below. If you think I've missed anything, also feel free to drop it down there. I'll take a look and quite possibly add it to the feedback document whenever we end up making it. Now, the plan is to be releasing a Destro and demo version of this video, most likely as well, probably tomorrow or the next day, pretty quickly. I'd like to try and get them all out before PTR actually hits, but we'll see where that goes. And with that being said, we don't even know if the changes are going to be in the first PTR build or not. Now, if there are any weak auras, profiles, or add-ons you guys saw during the video you'd like to acquire, they are all indeed available for free on my Twitch. If you want to swing by, hang out, ask any questions anytime, feel free to do so. I also want to give a huge shout out to my patrons. Thank you a million times. Thank you so much, guys, for all the support. Really, truly do appreciate it. If you guys want to see more WoW content and help support the channel, be sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons below. It helps out a ton. With all that being said, thanks, dudes, and I'll catch you all again soon on stream. Peace.